London, March, 1818. The drawing room at Forsyth House held the faint scent of bergamot tea and beeswax candles, their warm glow doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the cluster of women seated near the fireplace. Catherine Eleanor Forsyth stood by the window, her fingers pressed against the cool glass as she watched carriages pass along the rain-slicked street below, their wheels churning through puddles. At 24, Catherine knew precisely what her family thought of her. The whispers had followed her for 8 years, since the terrible winter when pneumonia had nearly claimed her life at 16. Fragile Catherine, delicate girl. She must be protected at all costs. The physicians had been clear in their pronouncements, delivered in grave tones that still echoed in her memory. Her constitution had been weakened, they said. Marriage would be acceptable, but childbirth? Impossible. Her body simply could not withstand such strain. Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp as a winter wind. "Catherine, dear, do come away from that window. The draught will make you ill. If you believe in second chances and stories that defy impossible odds, I would be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more tales of courage, love, and the strength we discover when everything seems lost." "I am quite well, Mama," Catherine replied, but she moved away from the window nonetheless, settling into a chair near the fire where her mother and aunt could keep a watchful eye upon her with greater ease. Lady Margaret Forsyth exchanged a meaningful glance with her sister, Mrs. Helena Ashby. Both women wore expressions of carefully practiced concern, the kind that Catherine had learned to recognize as precursor to unwanted advice. "We received another letter from your cousin in Bath," her mother said, smoothing the silk of her afternoon dress with practiced movements. "She writes that the waters there have done wonders for her constitution. Perhaps we should consider a visit this spring." Catherine suppressed a sigh. Bath, the refuge of invalids and those seeking miraculous cures. "I am quite content here in London, Mama." "Content, perhaps," her aunt interjected, setting down her teacup with a soft clink against the saucer. "But surely you must consider your future, Catherine. You are 24. Most young women of your age are already married with children." The familiar ache settled in Catherine's chest, but she kept her expression serene. "Most young women do not have my particular circumstances, which is precisely why we must be practical," her mother said, leaning forward with the intensity that always preceded her most fervent arguments. "A quiet life, Catherine. A gentle husband who understands your limitations. Someone who will not expect too much from you." Catherine's fingers tightened on the arms of her chair. 8 years. 8 years of being treated as though she were made of spun glass, as though a strong wind might shatter her completely. She had survived the pneumonia, recovered fully according to every physician save one, yet that single dissenting voice had been enough to condemn her to a life of cotton wool and constant vigilance. "I am not as fragile as you believe," she said quietly. Her mother's expression softened into something that might have been pity. "My dear child, we only want what is best for you. Dr. Morrison was very clear about the risks." "Dr. Morrison examined me 8 years ago," Catherine pointed out, struggling to keep frustration from her voice. "Surely my health has improved since then." "Some weaknesses never truly heal," Mrs. Ashby said, with the air of someone delivering profound wisdom. "Better to accept one's limitations than to tempt Providence through reckless defiance." The conversation might have continued in this vein, might have followed the same weary pattern it had traced countless times before, but the arrival of the afternoon post interrupted them. The butler entered bearing a silver salver, upon which rested a single cream-colored envelope sealed with unfamiliar wax. Lady Margaret took the letter, her eyebrows rising as she examined the seal. "This is addressed to you, Catherine, from Lady Cordelia Ashworth." Catherine accepted the envelope with curiosity, stirring beneath her habitual composure. Lady Cordelia was a distant connection, a woman she had met only twice at social gatherings, known more for her eccentric independence than her adherence to society's expectations. The letter was brief, but its contents unexpected. Lady Cordelia was hosting an intimate gathering at her London residence that very evening, a small dinner followed by cards and conversation. She hoped Catherine would attend, and had taken the liberty of including Lady Margaret in the invitation as well. "How unusual," Lady Margaret murmured, reading over Catherine's shoulder. "Lady Cordelia rarely entertains, and when she does, her guest lists are notoriously selective." "We should decline," Mrs. Ashby said immediately. "Catherine needs her rest, and evening entertainments are so taxing." But something in the letter's tone, in Lady Cordelia's careful phrasing, suggested this was more than a simple social gathering. Catherine found herself speaking before prudence could intervene. "I should like to attend, Mama. Lady Cordelia has been kind to include us." Her mother's hesitation was visible, a war between social obligation and maternal concern playing across her features. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, but we shall leave early if you show any sign of fatigue." That evening, as Catherine's maid helped her dress in a gown of soft blue silk, she caught her own reflection in the looking-glass and hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elegant knot, a few curls framing a face that, while perhaps not beautiful in the conventional sense, possessed a certain quiet strength. Her eyes, gray as London fog, held shadows that had nothing to do with ill health and everything to do with years of being told she was less than whole. Lady Cordelia's residence in Mayfair was smaller than many of the grand townhouses that lined the fashionable streets, but it possessed an air of refined taste that spoke of a woman who valued quality over ostentation. The drawing room where they were received glowed with candlelight, the furnishings arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal display. There were only 8 guests in total, Catherine noted. Lady Cordelia herself, resplendent in burgundy silk despite her advanced years. 2 younger women Catherine recognized from various social gatherings. A scholarly-looking gentleman who was introduced as a professor of natural philosophy, an elderly baronet and his wife, and standing near the fireplace, a tall figure in impeccable evening dress who turned as they entered. "May I present the Marquis of Lennox?" Lady Cordelia said, her voice carrying a note of particular satisfaction. "Lord Alexander, this is Lady Margaret Forsyth and her daughter, Miss Catherine Forsyth." Alexander James Thornfield, Marquis of Lennox, possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He was tall, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, despite appearing no older than 33. His features were striking rather than handsome, marked by a certain gravity that suggested a man who had long since abandoned frivolity. But it was his eyes that held Catherine's attention, dark and fathomless, carrying shadows that seemed to mirror her own. He bowed with perfect correctness. "Miss Forsyth, Lady Margaret, I am honored to make your acquaintance." His voice was deep, measured, with a quality that suggested careful control. Catherine curtsied, acutely aware of her mother's watchful presence at her elbow. "The honor is ours, my lord," Lady Margaret replied, her features already settling into the familiar, cautious assessment of a mother who had much invested in her daughter's future. Dinner was an intimate affair, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Lady Cordelia had a gift for drawing out her guests, asking questions that prompted genuine thought rather than rote responses. Catherine found herself seated across from Lord Alexander, and though propriety demanded she divide her attention among her dinner companions, she could not help but notice how his gaze returned to her throughout the meal. It was during a discussion of recent agricultural improvements that their eyes met and held. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared understanding that defied explanation. He looked at her, not as a fragile specimen defined by care, but as a person worthy of genuine regard. After dinner, as the ladies retired briefly before the gentlemen joined them for cards, Lady Cordelia drew Catherine aside with a gentle touch on her arm. "I hope you will forgive an old woman's presumption she said quietly, her shrewd eyes taking in Catherine's heightened color. "But I thought you and Lord Alexander might find each other's company interesting." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "My lady, I am not certain what you mean." "Do you not?" Lady Cordelia's smile was kind but knowing. "My dear, I have watched you at various gatherings over the past year. You carry yourself with such careful composure, as though you have learned to make yourself small and unobtrusive. And Lord Alexander, he wears his isolation like armor. Two people, each trapped by circumstances not entirely of their own making. I thought perhaps you might understand each other." Before Catherine could formulate a response, her mother appeared at her elbow, concern etched across her features. "Catherine, you look flushed. Perhaps we should retire early." "I am quite well, Mama," Catherine said, and was surprised to find it true. She felt more alive in this moment than she had in months, perhaps years. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Lord Alexander approached with deliberate purpose. "Miss Forsyth, I wonder if you might consent to partner me at whist." Lady Margaret began to demur, but Catherine spoke first. "I would be delighted, my lord." They settled at a card table with the elderly baronet and his wife as their opponents. As Catherine arranged her hand, she was intensely aware of Alexander's presence beside her, of the careful distance he maintained, of the way his long fingers handled the cards with unconscious grace. "Do you enjoy cards, Miss Forsyth?" he asked as play began. "I find them a pleasant diversion," she replied, leading with a low heart. "Though I confess I lack the ruthless instinct that makes for truly exceptional play." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, transforming his grave features. "I suspect ruthlessness is overrated in most pursuits." Their partnership proved surprisingly effective, their styles complementing each other with an ease that suggested deeper harmony. Between hands, conversation flowed with unexpected naturalness. "Lady Cordelia mentioned you spend much of the year at your estate in Kent," Catherine ventured during one pause in play. "Lennox Hall," he confirmed, something shifting in his expression. "It has been in my family for 6 generations. I find the solitude there conducive to thought." "You prefer the country to London society?" "I prefer authenticity to performance," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "London demands we wear masks, play parts assigned to us by birth and circumstance. In the country, one can simply be." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. "And yet here you are in London. Even those who prefer solitude must occasionally venture into the world," he replied, "though I confess I had begun to think such ventures pointless until this evening." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that both acknowledged and neither quite dared to name. Lady Margaret was watching from across the room, her expression caught between hope and concern. Catherine knew what her mother was thinking. The Marquis of Lennox was a tremendous match by any measure, but surely he would never consider a woman with Catherine's limitations. Yet as the evening progressed, as conversation deepened and barriers slowly lowered, Catherine found herself wondering if perhaps Lord Alexander's presence at this carefully orchestrated gathering was not quite the coincidence it appeared. It was near midnight when Lady Margaret finally insisted they must depart. As Catherine prepared to leave, Lord Alexander requested a private word, his manner formal, but his eyes holding something that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Forsyth," he said when they had stepped slightly apart from the others, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I wonder if you might permit me to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. There is something I should like to discuss, if you would be amenable." Catherine knew she should demur, should cite her health or some other excuse that would maintain the careful distance she had learned to keep between herself and possibility. Instead, she heard herself say, "I would be amenable to such a visit, my lord." His expression transformed, relief and something warmer flooding his features. "Then I shall count the hours until tomorrow." The carriage ride home passed in a blur of her mother's excited speculation about Lord Alexander's intentions, but Catherine barely heard. Her mind was replaying every moment of the evening, every word exchanged, every glance that had lasted a heartbeat too long. She did not sleep that night, restless energy keeping her wakeful despite her mother's predictions of exhaustion. Instead, she sat by her window watching the stars fade as dawn approached, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Lord Alexander arrived at precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon, his timing impeccable, his manner betraying only the slightest hint of nervousness. Lady Margaret received him in the formal drawing room, Catherine at her side, propriety observed even as expectation hummed like the taut string of a distant harp. "Lady Margaret, Miss Forsyth," he began, "I shall be direct, as I believe honesty serves us better than elaborate pretense. Lady Cordelia did not invite us both to her gathering by chance. She is a distant relation of mine and has taken it upon herself to meddle in what she perceives as my deliberate isolation." Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing, waiting. Alexander turned his attention fully to Catherine, his dark eyes searching hers. "I need to explain something about my family, about why a man of 33 remains unmarried despite considerable pressure from society and my own relations. The Thornfield men, Miss Forsyth, are not granted a long span of years." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Catherine felt her mother stiffen beside her. "My father died at 34, Alexander continued, his voice steady, but his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "My grandfather at 33, my great-grandfather at 32. Some called it a curse, others simply tragic coincidence. But the pattern has held true for 4 generations. I am now 33, already older than my grandfather ever was." "My lord," Lady Margaret began, but he raised a hand gently. "Please, let me finish. I have spent my adult life accepting that I would follow the same path. I refuse to marry, refuse to father children who would be left orphaned as I was, refuse to condemn any woman to young widowhood. But lately, I have begun to question whether a life lived entirely in fear of death is truly living at all." He took a step closer to Catherine, his gaze never wavering. "Last evening, I met a woman who seemed to understand what it means to have one's entire existence defined by others' perceptions of limitation, who carries herself with dignity despite being treated as fragile, who possesses strength that has nothing to do with physical constitution and everything to do with the courage required to keep standing when the world insists you should fall." Catherine's heart was thundering now, each beat echoing in her ears. "I am not a romantic man," Alexander said quietly. "I cannot promise you decades of life together or guarantee I will live to see next year. But I can promise you honesty, respect, and the freedom to be more than what others have decided you must be. Miss Forsyth, I am asking if you would consider a future with me, understanding fully the risks such a choice would entail." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Margaret appeared genuinely speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Catherine felt as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. One step forward would change everything. "My lord," she said carefully, finding her voice despite the emotion rising in her throat, "I appreciate your honesty more than you can know. But there is something you should understand about my own circumstances before any such consideration could proceed." She took a breath, gathering courage. 8 years ago, I contracted pneumonia. I nearly died. One physician, Dr. Morrison, declared that my constitution had been permanently weakened, that while marriage might be acceptable, childbearing would be impossible, potentially fatal. My family has treated me as an invalid ever since, despite my complete recovery in every observable way. Alexander's expression shifted, but not with the disappointment or concern she had expected. Instead, something that looked remarkably like recognition flickered across his features. "So you too have been sentenced to half a life based on someone else's dire predictions," he said softly. I have, Catherine admitted. If you sought a wife who could provide you with heirs, I am not that woman. Dr. Morrison was quite clear. And what do you believe, Miss Forsyth? Not what your family believes, not what Dr. Morrison proclaimed, but what you yourself know to be true about your own body and capabilities. The question struck her with the force of revelation. No one had ever asked her what she believed, what she knew, what she felt about her own condition. I believe, she said slowly, that I am stronger than they think, that the weakness they see exists more in their fear than in my flesh. But I have been told otherwise for so long that I confess I am no longer certain where truth ends and their narrative begins. Alexander nodded, something deep and understanding passing across his face. He considered the years he had wasted, his refusal to hope having been a desperate, superstitious attempt to protect himself from the inevitable. Then perhaps we are more perfectly matched than Lady Cordelia could have known. Two people condemned to limitation by others' fears, each wondering if those limitations are real or merely stories told until they became truth. He turned to Lady Margaret, his manner formal but his words carrying weight. Lady Margaret, I would like your permission to court your daughter properly. I will not pretend this would be a conventional match. I cannot offer certainty of long life or traditional expectations of heirs and succession. What I can offer is a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect, free from the constraints others have placed upon us both. Lady Margaret looked between them, clearly struggling with a situation for which her years of social navigation had not prepared her. My lord, I must be frank. My daughter's health is delicate. I could not in good conscience agree to any arrangement that might put her at risk. Mother, Catherine said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. I am 24 years old. I have spent 8 years allowing others to make decisions about my life based on fear rather than fact. Lord Alexander is offering me a choice, perhaps the first real choice anyone has offered me since my illness. I would like the opportunity to make it myself. The words hung in the air, a declaration of independence that shifted something fundamental in the room. Lady Margaret's expression wavered between maternal concern and reluctant respect. Very well, she said finally. You may call upon Catherine, my lord, but I will expect the utmost propriety. You have my word, Alexander replied, bowing. Then, to Catherine, might you be amenable to a drive through Hyde Park tomorrow afternoon? The weather is expected to be fine. I would like that very much, Catherine said, meeting his eyes and seeing there a reflection of her own cautious hope. After he departed, Lady Margaret sank into her chair with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of maternal anxiety accumulated over years. Catherine, are you quite certain about this? The Marquess seems an honorable man, but the circumstances are most irregular. Everything about my life has been irregular since I fell ill, Mama, Catherine replied gently. At least this irregularity is of my own choosing. The following weeks unfolded with a strange mixture of convention and quiet revolution. Alexander called regularly, always proper, always mindful of the boundaries society demanded. They drove through Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, walked in Kensington Gardens with Catherine's maid trailing at a respectful distance, attended the theatre where they sat in his box and discussed the performance with the ease of long acquaintance. But it was in their conversations that the real courtship occurred. Alexander spoke to Catherine as an equal, seeking her opinions on matters ranging from agricultural reform to the poetry of Wordsworth. He never treated her as fragile, never adjusted his language or subjects to accommodate her supposed delicacy. In return, Catherine found herself flowering under this regard, discovering reserves of opinion and intelligence she had learned to keep hidden. One afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks into their courtship, they sat in the Forsyth drawing room with tea growing cold between them, conversation having wandered into territory both more personal and more perilous than before. May I ask you something? Catherine ventured, setting down her cup with fingers that trembled only slightly. About your family's history. Have you ever considered that perhaps the pattern of early deaths might have explanations other than curse or fate? Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. What do you mean? Only that sometimes what appears to be pattern is merely coincidence given significance through repetition, she said carefully. Or that common factors, such as the strain of managing great estates or the tendency of men to ignore symptoms of illness, might create outcomes that seem supernatural but are quite ordinary. You think I am allowing superstition to govern my life, he said, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. I think we are both allowing others' narratives to define our possibilities, Catherine replied. You have decided you will die young because 4 men in your family did so. I have decided I cannot risk childbirth because one physician said my constitution was weakened. But what if we are both wrong? What if the stories we have been told are just that, stories rather than prophecies? Alexander rose and moved to the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. It is a terrifying thought, he said quietly, to consider that I might have wasted years in fear of a fate that was never inevitable. No more terrifying than the thought that I might have spent my entire life as an invalid when I was never truly ill at all, Catherine said, standing to join him. But perhaps, together, we might find the courage to discover the truth. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the war between hope and fear, between the desire to believe and the habit of despair. Catherine, he said, her name on his lips for the first time without the formal miss. What if I proposed something unconventional? What if I suggested that we marry, but with an agreement between us that we would never attempt to have children, that we would build a life together, accepting the limitations we both carry, but choosing partnership over isolation despite them? The proposal was not what society would call romantic. There was no declaration of passionate love, no poetry or grand gesture. Yet in its honesty, in its recognition of their shared reality, it moved Catherine more deeply than any conventional protestation could have done. You would marry me knowing I could never give you an heir? She asked. I would marry you, knowing that every year, perhaps every month we have together, is a gift rather than a guarantee, he replied. The Lennox title and estate will pass to my cousin upon my death, whether I have children or not. What I want, what I have begun to realize I need, is not an heir, but a partner. Someone who understands the weight of living under sentence, who will not waste our time together in pretense or performance. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. And you would not resent me? Not wish years from now that you had chosen differently? The only thing I would resent, Alexander said, reaching out to take her hand with careful gentleness, would be allowing fear to make me miss the opportunity to know you, to build something real with you, however long or brief that might be. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curved around hers with such care, as though she truly were as fragile as everyone claimed. But there was nothing condescending in his touch, only a recognition of the preciousness of what they were choosing. Then yes, she said softly. Yes, I will marry you with the understanding that we will protect each other from the expectations and demands that have defined us both for too long. Alexander released a breath that seemed to carry years of tension. We should discuss this with your mother, and I should speak to your father. My father passed away 5 years ago, Catherine said. My uncle serves as head of the family now, but Mama's consent is what matters most. Lady Margaret's reaction to their announcement was complex, a mixture of relief that her daughter would be settled, concern about the unusual nature of the arrangement, and barely concealed worry about the dark shadows that seemed to follow the Thornfield line. But she gave her blessing, perhaps recognizing that Catherine had already made her choice, and nothing short of imprisonment would change her mind. The engagement was brief by society's standards, a mere 6 weeks. Neither Catherine nor Alexander saw purpose in delay, when both understood too well how uncertain the future truly was. The wedding took place in June at St. George's in Hanover Square, a small affair attended by close family and a handful of intimate friends, Lady Cordelia beaming from her pew with the satisfaction of a successful matchmaker. Catherine wore ivory silk that whispered against marble floors as she walked toward Alexander, who waited at the altar with an expression that bordered on reverence. When he took her hand, his fingers trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the emotion he otherwise kept carefully controlled. The vows they spoke were traditional, promises to honor and cherish until death parted them. But beneath those conventional words lay a deeper understanding, an acknowledgement that their marriage would be built on acceptance of limitation rather than denial, on choosing presence over fear, even when the future remained uncertain. They traveled to Lenox Hall in Kent for their honeymoon, the estate Alexander had described with such affection during their courtship. The house was beautiful, a graceful manor of golden stone surrounded by gardens that sprawled toward woodland in the distance. Inside, portraits of Thornfield ancestors lined the walls, generations of men whose lives had ended far too soon, staring down from their gilded frames. Catherine found Alexander standing before these portraits late one evening, his posture tense, his eyes moving from one painted face to another as though searching for answers in pigment and canvas. "They all look so young," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "My father is 34 in this portrait," Alexander said, gesturing to a painting of a handsome man with dark hair and eyes that mirrored his own. "It was painted the year before he died. Sometimes I look at it and try to see signs of his impending death, some shadow or portent that might have warned him. But there is nothing, just a man in his prime who could not have known how little time remained." "And now you are 33, Catherine said, understanding the weight of standing in this gallery, of being older than one's grandfather ever was, but younger than one's father managed to be. "Does it feel different? Standing here knowing you have already outlived some of them?" "It feels like waiting," Alexander admitted. "Like I am in a race against an invisible opponent, never knowing if I am winning or merely delaying the inevitable." Catherine took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then perhaps we should stop waiting and start living. We made a choice, Alexander. We chose this marriage, this life together, with full knowledge of the risks. Let us not waste it in fear of what might come." He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the battle between hope and deeply ingrained fatalism. "You make it sound simple." "It is not simple at all," she replied, "but neither is it impossible. We will live as fully as we can manage for however long we are granted. That is all anyone can do, whether they carry family curses or medical pronouncements or simply the ordinary uncertainty that governs all human life." That night, in the master bedroom that had housed generations of Thornfield marriages, they came together with a tenderness born of mutual vulnerability. Alexander touched her as though she might break, his movements careful, his whispered questions constant. "Are you well? Is this too much? Should I stop?" And Catherine, who had spent 8 years being treated as though any exertion might shatter her, found herself laughing softly in the darkness, guiding his hands with more confidence than she had known she possessed. "I will not break," she told him. "I promise you, I am stronger than that." The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest of Catherine's life. They fell into comfortable routines, mornings spent in the library where Alexander managed his estate business while Catherine read or wrote letters, afternoons walking through the gardens or riding gentle horses across the estate lands. In the evenings, they dined together in the small family dining room, rather than the vast formal hall, conversation flowing with easy intimacy over roasted pheasant and wine. But beneath this contentment, Catherine was becoming aware of something her body was trying to tell her. A certain tenderness in her breasts, a queasiness in the mornings that she attributed at first to rich food or perhaps a minor stomach complaint. The possibility that crept into her awareness in the 3rd month of their marriage was so improbable, so contrary to everything she had been told, that she initially dismissed it as impossible. Yet the signs persisted, undeniable in their accumulation. When her courses failed to arrive for the second consecutive month, when the smell of coffee made her nauseous and certain foods became suddenly unbearable, Catherine could no longer deny what her body was declaring. She was pregnant. The realization struck her with the force of physical blow, leaving her gripping the edge of her dressing table as her reflection stared back from the mirror, pale and disbelieving. This was not supposed to happen. Dr. Morrison had been clear. Her body could not support a pregnancy. The risk would be too great. But here she stood, 3 months married, and her body had apparently decided to ignore all medical pronouncements and proceed anyway. Terror seized her, cold and consuming. Not terror of the pregnancy itself, but of what it would mean when Alexander learned of it. They had made an agreement, a promise that had formed the very foundation of their marriage. No children. It was the condition that had made everything else possible, the understanding that freed them both from the weight of expectation and legacy. And now she had broken it, albeit unknowingly, and the consequences would shatter the fragile peace they had built. For 3 days, Catherine said nothing, watching Alexander move through their daily routines with no awareness of the storm gathering. She observed him in the library, his dark head bent over correspondence, and wondered how long she could keep her secret. She saw him smile at something his estate manager said, that rare expression that transformed his grave features, and felt her heart break at the thought of watching that smile disappear. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Bodies betrayed their secrets eventually. She chose to tell him on a Wednesday evening after dinner, when they sat together in the drawing room as had become their habit. Alexander was reading, his long form relaxed in the chair across from hers, candlelight gilding his features with gold. For a moment, Catherine simply watched him, memorizing this peaceful scene before she destroyed it. "Alexander," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him look up immediately, concern flickering across his face. "What is wrong?" he asked, setting aside his book. "Are you unwell?" "I need to tell you something," Catherine said, her hands twisted together in her lap to stop their trembling. "Something that changes everything between us." He was on his feet in an instant, crossing to kneel before her chair, his hands covering hers with gentle pressure. "Whatever it is, we will face it together. Just tell me." She drew a shaking breath. "I am with child." The words fell into the silence between them like stones into a chasm. She watched Alexander's face, saw understanding dawn, saw the color drain from his features as the implications struck him. "No," he breathed, the word barely audible. "Catherine, no, this cannot be." "I am 3 months along," she continued, forcing the words out past the constriction in her throat. "I have consulted with Dr. Harrison here in the village. He confirms it." "I am pregnant, Alexander, and I know this violates our agreement, but I swear I did not plan it, did not intend it. I do not know how it happened when we were so careful." Alexander rose abruptly, turning away from her, one hand pressed to his mouth as though physically preventing words from escaping. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with barely controlled emotion. "You could die." "Dr. Morrison said the risk was considerable," Catherine acknowledged. "But Alexander, I have been thinking about what I said to you, about narratives and stories that we accept as truth. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps my body is stronger than anyone believed. Or perhaps you will die in childbed, and it will be my fault for bringing this upon you," Alexander said, his back still turned, his shoulders rigid with tension. "This is exactly what I feared, why I swore never to marry, never to put a woman in this position. And now I have done precisely that." Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks. "What would you have me do? There are ways, dangerous ways, to end a pregnancy. Women speak of them in whispers. But Alexander, I confess I do not wish to seek such measures. This child, however it came to be, is ours, and I find I want it, want the chance to see what we might create together." He turned then, and his face was a mask of anguish. You want me to choose between you and a child who does not yet exist? To risk losing you for the possibility of an heir I swore I never wanted? I want you to choose to trust, Catherine said, rising to face him despite her tears. To trust that perhaps fate is not as fixed as we believed. To trust my body's strength even when all the physicians say otherwise. To choose hope over fear. I cannot. I must process this. Alexander said, the words torn from him. Catherine, I cannot lose you. Do you understand? For 33 years, I have lived with the certainty of early death, have accepted that time is a luxury I will never possess. Then you appeared, and for the first time, I dared to imagine a future, brief as it might be. How can you ask me to risk that? To risk you? Because living in fear is not living at all, Catherine replied, stepping closer though he backed away. We made that choice together, remember? We agreed we would not let others' dire predictions govern our days. Yet now, at the first true test of that resolve, you want to retreat into the same terror that paralyzed you before we met. This is different, Alexander insisted. This is not abstract philosophy, but your life in immediate danger. And what of the child's life? Catherine asked quietly. Does that not matter? Alexander, I am already 3 months along. If we wait much longer, if we seek to end this pregnancy, I could die from that intervention as easily as from carrying to term. The choice is not between safety and risk, but between different forms of risk. He stared at her, trapped between competing terrors, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I need time to think, he said finally. I cannot. I must process this. Of course, Catherine said, though her heart cracked at the distance in his voice. Take whatever time you need. He left the room without another word, and Catherine sank back into her chair as sobs finally overwhelmed her composure. She had known this would be difficult, but she had not anticipated the depth of his reaction, the way fear could transform the man who had shown her such tenderness into someone who could barely look at her. The days that followed were the darkest Catherine had known since her illness. Alexander moved through Lenox Hall like a ghost, present but absent, speaking when necessary, but offering nothing of the warmth and intimacy that had characterized their marriage. He took his meals in the estate office, slept in a separate chamber, spent long hours riding across the lands as though distance might outrun his demons. It was in these solitary rides that he began to believe his very presence was a danger to Catherine, a cruel thought that justified his distance as a perverse form of protection. Catherine, meanwhile, felt her body changing with each passing day. The nausea intensified, her dresses grew tight across the bodice, her energy flagged in the afternoons. She consulted regularly with Dr. Harrison, who examined her with gentle thoroughness and pronounced her remarkably healthy, considering her supposedly delicate constitution. I confess, Miss Catherine, he said, forgetting in his familiarity that she was now married. You seem to be thriving in this condition. Whatever Dr. Morrison feared, I see no signs of it. Your heartbeat is strong, your color good, your overall vigor better than many women I attend who have borne multiple children. The words should have comforted her, should have provided ammunition against Alexander's fears. Instead, they only highlighted the growing chasm between them. He would not listen, would not even allow her close enough to try to bridge the distance his terror had created. It was Lady Cordelia who finally intervened, arriving at Lenox Hall unannounced 6 weeks after Catherine had revealed her pregnancy. She swept into the drawing room, where Catherine sat attempting needlework with fingers that trembled too much to make neat stitches. My dear child, Lady Cordelia said, taking in Catherine's pale face and shadowed eyes with a sharp glance. You look absolutely wretched. Where is that fool nephew of mine? Riding, Catherine said dully. He is always riding these days. Lady Cordelia made a sound of disgust. Men, particularly Thornfield men. I swear the family talent for dramatic melancholy rivals their supposed curse for harm. Wait here." She departed in a rustle of silk, and Catherine could hear her voice echoing through the halls, imperious and brooking no argument. "Alexander James Thornfield, you will present yourself in the drawing room immediately. I did not travel 2 days in a cramped carriage to be ignored by my own blood." When Alexander appeared, his expression was wary, his clothes dusty from riding. He stopped short when he saw Catherine, pain flickering across his features before he masked it behind cool formality. "Sit," Lady Cordelia commanded, pointing to a chair. "Both of you, I am going to speak, and you are going to listen." Neither dared disobey. Catherine perched on the edge of the sofa. Alexander took the indicated chair, and Lady Cordelia stood before them like a general addressing wayward troops. "I am 73 years old," she began. "I have buried 2 husbands, 3 children, and more friends than I care to count. I know something about loss, about grief, about the terror of loving when death is always lurking at the periphery. So I'm going to tell you both something that I learned too late in my own life to do me much good, but perhaps it will serve you better." She fixed Alexander with a look that could have melted iron. "You think you are protecting her by pushing her away. You believe that if you start saying goodbye now, start preparing for her death, it will hurt less when it comes. You are wrong. Every day you spend in fear, every hour you waste in separation, is a day lost forever. If Catherine dies tomorrow, or in childbirth, or at 93, the only thing you will regret is not cherishing every moment you were given." "You do not understand," Alexander began, but Lady Cordelia cut him off with a raised hand. "I understand perfectly. I understand that you are a coward, Alexander. Not because you fear death. We all fear death. But because you are allowing that fear to make you cruel. Look at your wife. Look at what your terror is doing to her." Alexander's gaze shifted to Catherine, and she saw him truly see her for the first time in weeks. Saw him take in the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled in her lap, the defeat that had settled over her like a shroud. "Catherine," he whispered, anguish breaking through his carefully maintained control. "You are punishing her for being pregnant," Lady Cordelia continued relentlessly, blaming her for a condition she did not choose and cannot undo. "You made vows to her, Alexander, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Did you mean them? Or were they just pretty words spoken when you thought circumstances would never test them?" "I meant them," Alexander said, his voice raw with distress. "God help me, I meant every word." "Then prove it," Lady Cordelia said. "Stop hiding in fear and be her husband. Be present, whatever comes. That is all any of us can do in this uncertain world. Be present." She swept toward the door, pausing to look back at them both. "I am staying the night. By morning, I expect to find the 2 of you acting like the adults I believed you to be when I meddled in bringing you together." The silence after her departure was profound. Catherine and Alexander sat frozen, neither quite able to bridge the distance that weeks of separation had created. Finally, Alexander rose and crossed to kneel before her, just as he had the night she told him about the pregnancy. But this time, when he took her hands, tears were streaming down his face. "Forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. "Catherine, forgive me. You were right. I became the very thing I swore I would not be, allowing fear to make me cruel. I have been a coward, preparing to lose you instead of choosing to love you. Can you possibly forgive me?" Catherine felt her own tears fall, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "You were afraid. We are both afraid. But Alexander, we cannot let fear win. We cannot let it steal what time we have together." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I am terrified of losing you." The thought of watching you suffer, of holding our child knowing you died to bring it into the world, it breaks something in me." "Then do not think of endings," Catherine said, one hand moving to cup his face, making him look at her. "Think only of now, this moment. We are here, together, and that is enough. Tomorrow is not promised to anyone, curse or no curse, pregnancy or no pregnancy. All we have is today." "How did you become so wise?" Alexander asked, something like wonder breaking through his grief. "I had 8 years of being treated as though I might die at any moment," Catherine replied with a small, sad smile. "It teaches you to live in the present, because the future is too uncertain to waste your life preparing for it." Slowly, carefully, Alexander rose and drew her into his arms, holding her with desperate tenderness. Catherine felt the tension that had coiled in her chest for weeks finally begin to release, her body relaxing against his as though coming home after long absence. "I cannot promise I will not be afraid," Alexander said into her hair. "I cannot swear that the terror will not rise up again as your time draws near." "I am not asking for promises," Catherine replied. "I am only asking for your presence. Be with me, Alexander. That is all I need." They stood together in the drawing room as twilight deepened outside the windows, holding each other as though they might anchor one another against all the storms to come. And perhaps, Catherine thought, they could. Not through certainty or guarantees, but through the simple choice to stay present, to love despite fear, to trust that hope was not foolishness, but the bravest thing either of them could choose. The following months transformed Lenox Hall. Alexander was true to his word, remaining present through Catherine's pregnancy with a devotion that surprised even him. He read to her in the evenings, walked with her in the gardens when her energy permitted, sat beside her when morning sickness left her weak and miserable. He consulted with Dr. Harrison regularly, peppering the poor physician with questions that betrayed both his medical ignorance and his desperate need for reassurance. Catherine bloomed under his attention, her body rounding with the child growing within. She felt stronger than she ever had, as though pregnancy had unlocked reserves of vitality that years of being treated as invalid had suppressed. When Alexander worried, she would take his hand and place it on her swelling abdomen, letting him feel their child's movements, those fluttering sensations that grew more pronounced with each passing week. "Do you feel that?" she would ask, smiling at his expression of wonder. "Our child is strong, Alexander. Whatever comes, we have created something remarkable." But as autumn deepened toward winter, as Catherine entered her 7th month, complications arose that turned Alexander's controlled fear into something approaching panic. She woke one morning with cramping pains that sent Dr. Harrison riding to Lenox Hall in the gray hours before dawn. His examination was thorough, his expression grave. When he emerged from Catherine's chamber, Alexander was pacing the corridor outside, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "Your wife is experiencing what we call false labor," Dr. Harrison explained. "The pains are real but not productive. They are a warning that her body is under considerable strain." "What can be done?" Alexander demanded. "Complete bed rest," the physician said firmly. "No exertion whatsoever. No walking, no stairs, minimal activity of any kind. If she continues to experience these pains, there is risk the child will come too early, and that would be very dangerous for both mother and infant." Alexander's face went white. How dangerous! Dr. Harrison met his eyes with the honesty of a man who respected his patient too much to lie. At 7 months, a child born early has perhaps 1 chance in 4 of survival. And the labor itself, coming so prematurely, could cause hemorrhaging or other complications that would endanger Lady Catherine's life. "My lord, I will be blunt with you. If your wife does not rest completely, we could lose them both." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Catherine, watching from her bed through the partially open door, saw him stagger slightly, one hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. "She will rest," he said, his voice tight with controlled terror. "I will see to it personally." The weeks that followed tested Alexander in ways he had never imagined. Catherine, normally so patient and accommodating, chafed terribly against her confinement. She argued, pleaded, tried to convince him that Dr. Harrison was being overly cautious, that she felt perfectly well despite the occasional cramping. "I am not made of glass," she insisted one afternoon when Alexander refused to let her walk even the short distance to the window. "I cannot lie in this bed every moment for the next 2 months." "You can and you will," Alexander replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Catherine, I cannot lose you. Do you understand? I will lock you in this room if I must." "That is not your choice to make," she flared back, temper rising. "This is my body, my child. You cannot imprison me for your peace of mind." They stared at each other across the chasm of fear and frustration. Two people who loved each other desperately, but could not agree on how to navigate the terror that surrounded them. It was Catherine who finally softened, seeing the shadows under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought she was not looking. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "You are afraid. So am I. But Alexander, I need you to trust me to know my own limits, and I need you to stay alive," he replied, his voice breaking. "Is that so unreasonable?" They reached an uneasy compromise. Catherine would rest as Dr. Harrison advised, but Alexander would spend his days in her chamber, reading to her, managing estate business from a desk moved to her bedside, ensuring she was never alone with her thoughts and fears. It was an unconventional arrangement, but they had long since abandoned convention in favor of what actually worked for their particular circumstances. December arrived with cold winds and the first snowfall. Catherine was in her 8th month now, her body heavy with the child that moved constantly within her. Alexander had taken to sleeping in a chair beside her bed, unable to bear the thought of being in a separate room if complications arose in the night. It was on a frozen morning in late December that Catherine woke with a gasp of pain that was immediately, unmistakably different from the false labor she had experienced before. Alexander was awake instantly, his hand finding hers in the gray pre-dawn light. "Catherine?" "It is time," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "Alexander, our child is coming." The ensuing hours dissolved into a torrent of pain and terror and desperate hope. Doctor Harrison arrived, summoned by a servant sent riding through snow-covered lanes. A midwife from the village came shortly after, her experienced hands and calm manner a counterpoint to the physician's growing concern. Catherine had been warned that childbirth was painful, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. Wave after wave of contractions racked her body, each one stealing her breath and making rational thought impossible. Through it all, Alexander remained at her side, defying every convention that said men should be kept far from the birthing chamber. "Get him out," the midwife said at one point, her tone sharp. "This is no place for a husband." "He stays," Catherine gasped between pains. "I need him here." And so Alexander stayed, his face gray with helpless anguish as he watched Catherine suffer through something he could not prevent or alleviate. He held her hand, wiped sweat from her face, murmuring fierce words of love and encouragement, repeating promises that she possessed the strength to endure, transforming his anxiety into a bulwark against her pain. Hours passed. Dawn gave way to afternoon to evening. Catherine grew increasingly exhausted, her strength flagging as the labor continued without progress. "Something is wrong," Dr. Harrison said quietly to Alexander during a brief respite. "The child is positioned poorly. If this continues much longer, we will lose them both." "What can be done?" Alexander demanded, his voice hoarse from hours of silent prayer. "There are interventions. Forceps, turning the child, all carry significant risk," the physician said carefully. "Or we wait, hope that nature corrects itself, but that too is a gamble we may lose." Alexander looked at Catherine, at her pale face and pain-darkened eyes, and felt his composure abruptly fail. This was his worst nightmare made real, the scene he had dreaded since the moment she told him about the pregnancy. His wife dying while he stood helpless, their child dying with her, all his fears proven correct. But then Catherine's eyes met his, and even through her exhaustion, even through pain that must have been unbearable, she smiled at him. A small, tired smile that held all the courage he had ever seen. "Trust me," she whispered. "Alexander, trust me. I am stronger than you know." And in that moment, watching her face death with such quiet bravery, Alexander made a choice. He could let fear paralyze him, could stand frozen as the woman he loved slipped away. Or he could trust, could believe in her strength even when all evidence suggested otherwise. "Do whatever you must," he told Dr. Harrison. "But save her life, doctor. She is all I have." What followed was brutal in its efficiency. The midwife and physician worked together, their experienced hands manipulating the child's position while Catherine screamed with pain that seemed to have no end. Alexander held her through it, his own tears falling onto her sweat-dampened hair, his whispered words a prayer and a promise. "I am here. I am with you. You are so brave, so strong. Stay with me, Catherine. Please stay with me." And then, after what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only minutes, a change. The midwife's expression shifted from concern to cautious hope. "One more push, my lady. Just one more, and your child will be here." Catherine gathered what remained of her strength, her hand crushing Alexander's with desperate force, and pushed with everything she had left. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound broke the tension, high and thin and utterly miraculous. The cry of a newborn, protesting its sudden entrance into the cold world. "A girl," the midwife announced, her voice warm with satisfaction. "A healthy, strong girl." Alexander felt his knees weaken, only pride keeping him upright. A daughter. They had a daughter. But his eyes were on Catherine, on her chalk-white face, on the blood that stained the linens beneath her. "Catherine," he said urgently. "Catherine, look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, exhausted but alert. "Our daughter?" "She is perfect," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "Absolutely perfect, just like her mother." Dr. Harrison was working quickly, his hands sure as he tended to Catherine's bleeding. The midwife cleaned the infant, swaddling her in soft blankets before bringing her to rest in Catherine's arms. Catherine looked down at the tiny face, the rosebud mouth, the wisp of dark hair, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been so frightened of you. But you were worth every moment of fear." The baby quieted at the sound of her mother's voice, her tiny fingers curling around Catherine's thumb with surprising strength. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife, his free hand gently touching their daughter's soft cheek. Tears streamed down his face unchecked. "What shall we name her?" Catherine asked, her voice weak, yet surprisingly steady. Alexander thought of the months of fear, the weeks of confinement, the hours of agonizing labor. He thought of how close they had come to losing everything, how Catherine had faced death with such courage. And he thought of what this child represented, not just an heir, but a triumph over every dark prediction that had governed their lives. "Victoria," he said softly, "our victory over fear." Catherine smiled, her eyes already drifting closed with exhaustion. "Victoria. Yes, perfect." The next days were a blur of recovery and wonder. Catherine healed slowly but steadily, her body proving once again that Dr. Morrison's dire predictions had been excessively pessimistic. Dr. Harrison proclaimed her recovery remarkably robust, and though he counseled caution, he saw no reason she could not eventually bear more children if they chose. Alexander spent hours simply watching his wife and daughter as though he could not quite believe they were real, that they had both survived when everything had suggested they would not. He held Victoria with the careful reverence usually reserved for precious relics, marveling at her tiny perfection. But it was one night, perhaps a week after the birth, that the full weight of what had occurred finally struck him. Catherine had fallen asleep after feeding Victoria, both mother and child, peaceful in the candlelight. Alexander sat in his chair, watching them, and suddenly found himself shaking with sobs he could no longer contain. The terror of nearly losing them, the weeks of fear, the hours of helpless watching, all of it crashed over him in a wave that left him gasping. He wept for the child he had feared to want, for the wife he had almost lost, for all the years he had wasted in preparation for death instead of celebration of life. Catherine woke to the sound of his crying, her eyes instantly alert despite her exhaustion. "Alexander? What is wrong?" He looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "I almost lost you." "Catherine, I almost lost you both, and it would have been my fault. If I had insisted you end the pregnancy when you first told me, if I had placed my fear above your courage, I would have lost everything that matters." "But you did not," Catherine said gently. "You chose trust over fear, Alexander. You stayed with me through the darkest hours. That is all that matters." "I spent 33 years convinced I would die young," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "I built my entire life around that certainty, refused to hope for anything more. And then you taught me that perhaps the stories we tell ourselves are not always true. That courage means living despite fear, not living without it." He moved to sit beside her on the bed, careful not to disturb sleeping Victoria. "I am 34 now, the age my father was when he died. I have already outlived my grandfather, and I find I am not ready to die, Catherine. I want years with you, with our daughter. I want to watch Victoria grow, to argue with her when she is stubborn like her mother, to walk her down the aisle one day. I want all the things I convinced myself I could never have." Catherine took his hand, squeezing gently. "Then choose to live, Alexander. Choose to believe that perhaps the Thornfield curse was never a curse at all, but a story told so many times it became self-fulfilling. Your father died young, and your grandfather, but perhaps they died of ordinary causes that had nothing to do with fate or doom. Perhaps you are simply a man who can choose to live rather than wait to die." He looked at her, at the wisdom in her gray eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. She was right. She had always been right. The curse was not blood or fate but belief, a narrative passed down through generations until it became truth through repetition. He was the first Thornfield man in generations to question it, to choose hope over despair. "I love you," he said, the words inadequate for the depth of what he felt but all he had to offer. "I love you beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond everything I thought I knew about myself." "I love you too," Catherine replied, her free hand cupping his face with infinite tenderness. "Now come to bed properly. Your daughter and I need you whole, not exhausted from nights spent in that chair." Alexander climbed into bed beside his wife. Victoria nestled safely between them, and for the first time in his adult life, he slept without dreams of death and loss. The winter passed, giving way to spring. Victoria thrived, growing from a tiny, fragile-seeming infant into a robust baby with her father's dark eyes and her mother's quiet determination. Catherine regained her strength week by week, her body once again proving that the limitations others had placed upon her existed more in their minds than in reality. Alexander watched the passage of time with new eyes. He marked his 35th birthday in March, the age his grandfather had been when death claimed him. The day passed unremarkably, filled with the ordinary joys of family life rather than dread and premonition. "I am 35, he said to Catherine that evening as they sat together in the drawing room, Victoria asleep in the nursery upstairs. "Older than my grandfather ever was." "And how does it feel?" Catherine asked, setting aside the letter she had been writing to her mother. "Strange," Alexander admitted. I spent so many years convinced I would never reach this age that now that I have, I hardly know what to do with it. The future stretches out before me, uncertain but possible, and I find I am no longer afraid of it. Perhaps a little afraid, Catherine suggested with a smile. Fear is not entirely bad after all. It keeps us cautious, mindful of dangers. The problem was never that you felt fear, but that you allowed it to govern every choice. When did you become so wise? He asked, echoing the question he had posed months earlier. I learned from the best teacher, she replied, rising to come sit beside him. A man who taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to live fully despite it. They sat together as twilight deepened outside the windows, comfortable in the silence that only long intimacy can create. After a time, Catherine spoke again, her voice hesitant but determined. I have been thinking, she said carefully, about what Dr. Harrison said regarding future children. Alexander stiffened slightly, old fears rising despite his best efforts to suppress them. Catherine, we nearly lost you with Victoria. I could not bear to risk that again. I am not suggesting we proceed with undue haste, she assured him. But Alexander, I survived. Despite everything Dr. Morrison predicted, despite all the fears and warnings, I survived, and so did our daughter. Does that not suggest that perhaps I am stronger than anyone believed? That my body is capable of more than we gave it credit for? I believe I have demonstrated that I can safely carry a child to term. He wanted to say no, wanted to close the conversation down before it could lead to decisions that terrified him. But he had promised himself he would no longer let fear make his choices, and he meant to keep that promise. What are you suggesting? He asked carefully. Only that we do not close the door on the possibility, Catherine said, that if in a year or two we find ourselves blessed with another child, we face that blessing with hope rather than terror. Victoria deserves siblings, Alexander, and I confess I would like to give them to her. He looked at her, at the quiet determination in her eyes, and felt his resistance crumble. She was right, as she so often was. They had faced the worst and survived. To allow fear to dictate the rest of their lives would be to waste the miracle they had been granted. Very well, he said softly, but you must promise me something in return. What? That you will never again accuse me of being overprotective when I hover during your pregnancies, he said with the faint smile that still came, rarely, but with increasing frequency. I make no promises about being calm or reasonable when you are carrying my children. Catherine laughed, the sound warm and free. I would expect nothing less. 2 years passed. Victoria grew into a bright, curious child who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger and her mother's quiet resilience. Alexander threw himself into the management of his estates and the raising of his daughter with the dedication of a man who had been granted unexpected years and was determined not to waste them. And in the spring of 1822, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no panic, no emotional withdrawal, no weeks of separation and fear. Alexander simply held her close, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, and whispered, "We will face this together." The pregnancy progressed more easily than the first, perhaps because Catherine knew what to expect, or perhaps because her body had learned through Victoria's birth that it was capable of extraordinary things. She bloomed with health, her energy flagging only in the final months when carrying the weight of the child became physically taxing. Alexander was attentive, but not smothering, present, but not hovering. He had learned, through hard experience, to trust Catherine's judgment about her own body, to believe in her strength even when fear whispered that he should lock her away and protect her from all possible harm. Their son was born on a warm June day, his arrival swift and uncomplicated in comparison to his sister's dramatic entrance. Alexander was there throughout, had never seriously considered being anywhere else. And when Dr. Harrison placed the squalling infant in his arms, he felt his heart expand in ways he had not thought possible. Another miracle, he said, looking from his newborn son to his wife, exhausted but radiant in the aftermath of labor. How did we get so fortunate? We chose to be, Catherine replied simply. We chose hope over fear, life over mere survival. That is all the magic required. On an afternoon in late spring, 4 years after Victoria's birth and 2 after their son William's arrival, Alexander sat on the veranda at Lenox Hall, watching his children play in the garden below. Victoria was 5 now, her dark hair flying loose as she chased butterflies through the rose beds. William, at 2, toddled after his sister with determined concentration. Catherine joined him, settling into the chair beside his with the easy grace of someone thoroughly comfortable in her own skin. She was 5 months pregnant with their 3rd child, her body showing the gentle swell that no longer inspired terror, but rather quiet anticipation. "What are you thinking?" she asked, following his gaze to their children. "That I am 36 years old," Alexander said, "far older than any Thornfield man in 4 generations. That I have a wife I adore, 2 beautiful children with a 3rd on the way. That I wield the fear rather than letting it command me." "Do you still feel it?" Catherine asked. "The fear that you might die young?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "I wake in the night occasionally, heart pounding, certain that this is the day the curse catches up with me. And then I hear you breathing beside me, or one of the children cries out and needs comfort, and I remember that fear is just fear. It does not predict the future or control my fate. It is simply something I feel and then choose to move past." Catherine reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am so proud of you, of the man you have become, the father you are to our children." "I could not have done any of it without you," Alexander said, bringing her hand to his lips. "You taught me how to be brave, Catherine, how to live rather than merely exist." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Victoria teach William how to identify different flowers in the garden, her patient explanation drifting up to them on the warm spring air. "Do you remember what we promised each other?" Catherine asked after a time. "On our wedding day, when we both believed we were accepting half a life." "That we would protect each other from expectations and demands," Alexander said. "That we would build something real within our limitations." "We were so foolish," Catherine said with a soft laugh. "We thought we were accepting limitation when we were actually claiming freedom. Freedom to define our own lives, to write our own story instead of living out the narratives others had written for us." Alexander looked at her, at the sunlight gilding her hair with gold, at the gentle swell of their 3rd child beneath her gown, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "The curse was never real," he said quietly. "The lack of any medical or supernatural proof suggests that our ancestors' belief was the only true doom. Or if it was not a curse of early death, but of early surrender. My father, my grandfather, all of them, they died young, not because of some supernatural doom, but because they believed so completely in that doom that they never truly tried to live. They accepted the story, prepared for early death, and in preparing for it, perhaps hastened it through stress and fear and the toll that constant dread takes on a body." "And you chose differently," Catherine said. "We chose differently," he corrected. "You showed me how. Every time you refused to accept the limitations others placed on you, every time you claimed your own strength despite all the voices saying you were weak, you taught me that stories can be rewritten, that we are not bound by other people's narratives about who we must be." Victoria's laughter rang out across the garden, pure and joyful. William had fallen into a flower bed and was covered in soil, his face split in a grin that showed tiny white teeth. Catherine started to rise, maternal instinct pulling her toward her children, but Alexander gently pressed her back into her seat. "Let me," he said. "You rest. You are carrying our future, after all." He descended to the garden and scooped up his muddy son, who shrieked with delight at being lifted high into the air. Victoria ran to him, demanding he judge whether she had correctly identified all the roses. And standing there in the afternoon sunlight, his children's voices filling the air with music, Alexander felt something he had spent most of his life believing impossible. He felt at peace. Not the resignation of a man accepting his fate, but the genuine peace of someone who had chosen to live fully in each moment rather than constantly bracing for loss. He would die someday. He knew that. Everyone died. But between now and that eventual end, however near or distant it might be, he would live, truly, completely live. Catherine watched from the veranda, one hand resting on the child growing within her, and smiled. They had been so afraid, both of them, had believed themselves condemned to half-lives defined by others' dire predictions. Instead, they had found in each other the courage to demand more, to insist that they could be whole, could be happy, could build something beautiful despite every voice saying otherwise. The future was still uncertain. It always would be. But uncertainty was not the same as impossibility. And as the afternoon sun painted the garden in shades of gold and amber, as her husband's laughter mingled with their children's voices, Catherine knew that they had already won the only victory that truly mattered. They had chosen hope. They had chosen life. They had chosen each other. And that, in the end, was everything. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of courage, love, and the strength to rewrite our own narratives touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope, resilience, and the power of choosing life over fear.